So my previous video I had spoke about psychology and Zen, therapy versus transformation, and how essentially through mindfulness meditation, which is used in psychology, a core principle and technique in Zen Buddhism, helps with symptom management, but yet sort of stops short of providing a really deeper transformation of personality, which in return can actually provide much more substantial and longer lasting symptoms management. And this happens through sort of a systematic desensitization to false identifications of basically the clothing of the core concepts that clothe our concepts of self, our identity, our ego. Your ego is sort of like your sense of self that's wearing false clothing. It's sort of misrepresenting you and misinterpreting a lot of cues. Some of it's reflecting some of the core principles of yourself that are honest and they resonate well with us, and some of it not so much. Some of it may be very external, based in our experiences with our family and friends and our social environment and our subcultures, meaning fashion, music, entertainment, what career you work in, what sport you play. There's all these subcultures that we belong into, and they begin to have impressions upon us as well, some for good, some for bad. What's important for us as a evolving and growing human being is to be able to differentiate the false narratives of self from the instinctual, more well resonating, from the truth, from the lies, I guess you could say, and from being who you really are internally versus any kind of false concepts that you've given yourself. That's the task that we are faced with, and the task is very important because it literally can contribute to happiness or bliss and peace and balance, or it can contribute to mental illness, can create obsessive compulsive thoughts, can create false narratives and negative perceptions of self. So one of the things I wanted to do in this video was sort of highlight some of the science, I guess you could say, behind the ego and how it works and what it does. And one of the concepts I've been exploring more lately in that regard, because there's so many different languages we can use and so many different terms, interchangeable terms that we can use to discuss these things, from a Buddhist context or a philosophical context or a spiritual or religious or even just a psychology context. And I'm going to focus on the psychology context, and the concept we're going to be looking at is self-cognitive schema. Now, if you don't know what schema is, simply put, it's defined as a pattern of thought or behavior that organizes categories of information and the relationship among them. In other words, it's sort of an automatic unconscious reference point for various things in our life that facilitates evolution by removing the incredible amount of time it would take and thinking it would take to rationalize every detail in our daily experience. If I were to blindfold you and then walk you into a doctor's office and take the blindfold off, within a split second you would know where you were. You wouldn't have to stop and think and look at everything and every symbol in the room and analyze, okay, that's a table and that's a model, and okay, you put it all together. I'm at a doctor's office. So we have these schemas, which are essentially an unconscious automatic reference point with everything. We use this with everything. When you walk out your front door, when you look around your room right now, and it's not just in your environment, it's things also in yourself. We have these automatic reference points, and they facilitate our evolution by allowing us to move quicker, more freely, and sort of automatic without having to, again, analyze and rationalize every single aspect of our life. Imagine, trying to survive thousands of years ago in the wild if you had to stop and analyze every threat. So one instinctive schema can be looked at as when you see a spider or a snake and you jump out of the way. You don't stop and think, well, what is that? Is that poisonous? Is that a poisonous snake? You just instinctually move. But how do you do that? No one taught you that. It's not like when you were a young kid, someone had to show you what a snake was. You just knew instinctually to avoid snakes, that there was a danger associated with that. And this is found in the animal kingdom, and there's multiple examples of this on that level. But more specifically, I'm looking at cognitive schema as it relates to the self. Now, again, there's different types of schema. There's gender schema, there's racial schema, and essentially schemas create stereotypes because it's automatic reference points. So it can't help itself. It's inevitably going to create sort of a stereotype of what a doctor's office is, a stereotype of a certain race or a certain place, a certain sense of self. There's even a stereotype of ourself, which is a really fascinating concept. And when you get into Zen Buddhism and psychology and you're doing self-work about wanting to change things about yourself, it's a really powerful concept that you have stereotypes that you've created inevitably about yourself. And of course, stereotypes are often wrong, or at least have components that are wrong and misleading and misguiding. So one example of cognitive schema as it relates to racial schema is a series of studies that have been done, commonly labeled shoot or don't shoot. And essentially what these studies do is they would have a person holding an object, sometimes a gun, sometimes a comb or a phone, and then they would have a viewer look at these pictures of this person. They would look through a series of these pictures of different people, either holding a gun or another object, and they would have less than a second to identify whether that person had a gun and was posing a threat, or whether they had a cell phone and they were not posing a threat. In a split second, and they had to hit a button and decide on a split second notice to shoot or not to shoot. Sort of, if they were a police officer and they came upon this person, is this person a threat? And what they found was a lot of black people were being shot. They were being identified even when they had a cell phone in their hand. They were being identified as a threat and they were being shot. Now, the interesting thing here was, it wasn't just white people that were shooting more black people that were actually not posing a threat, that were holding a cell phone, but black people as well were doing it. So this was interesting. This made people look at things a little differently. And what they were finding was that there was a cognitive schema happening here, because since there was less than a second, a split second to react, it wasn't like people were sitting here having time to be sort of racist or automatic racist about it, but they had automatic stereotypes. They had automatic preconceived associations with threats here. And it happened in the black community as well. So that reframed racism in a different light, not downplaying racism. Racism is a real phenomenon, but through cognitive schema, we observed it as an additional problem, an additional challenge here. We said, hell, now we have to acknowledge that there's a sort of unconscious, automatic prejudice or false association happening here, which can result in, unfortunately, innocent people being shot. Looking at the same concept here, this phenomenon, through the lens of self-schema and ego, or auto reference points that we have for our identity, you can kind of see where we can have similar things happen where we are creating false reference points and thereby having false reactions and false identities from misconceived ideas of ourselves. So one of the things that cognitive schema does for ourselves in terms of our ego is it seeks to inform us of who we are. And this is easier in a paradoxical way than just being, meaning just no thought. Having a core felt understanding of who you are is a very different, deeper, sometimes more challenging phenomenon, at least initially, than having a concept. A schema is much quicker. You say, I am this person, and that is because of this, and I do these sort of things. Maybe you're someone in the military, maybe you're an artist, maybe you're a doctor, maybe you're a lawyer, or you're a politician. You have some kind of identity that you can latch onto and label yourself. Makes it much easier. I'm an African American, I'm a Caucasian, I'm an Asian. I vote this way, I live here, I'm from this, I'm from that. There are so many categories and organizations of self that we label ourselves essentially, that create a sort of superficial and pseudo identification of self. It's an automatic reference point, and it's quick and it's easy, and it creates a sort of sense of balance because we have an idea of who we are, and that makes it easier for us to navigate in our worlds, right? So it's scary not knowing who you are, and that's why the ego's there, because the ego creates a sort of a blanket for us to lay on and clothe ourselves with. But again, the problem with the ego is that blanket or that clothing is largely false. And it's largely negative, and it largely keeps us out of the present moment and keeps us in our head all the time. And it's self-defeating, and it robs us of sort of a felt oneness with a more accurate resonance of who we really are. So essentially, a cognitive schema, which is trying to do something positive for us, is trying to create a mental and emotional balance. And to some degree it does, but to a large degree it creates an imbalance. It really operates to a persistent distortion of self. But schemas can change, especially systematically. We can change our stereotypes of the schemas. We can change ideas of schema and associations. For example, trauma victims, there's schema therapy that are often used with trauma victims. So let's say you were someone who had a near fatal accident near a stop sign. and you develop PTSD because of it. And every time you've seen a stop sign or just even the color red, it automatically had these identifications with the trauma you went through, and it brought up these same feelings. You had created this conditioned false schema there. And what we would do is we would systematically help desensitize you to that false schema or to that false identification, and thereby bring about and restore a more peaceful, natural balance. Well, we use that with trauma, but we don't use that with self, or the parts of self that are false, the false narratives, the things that the self-defeating voice and the limitations of who we are perceptually. And I find that fascinating. Why don't we use that? And really, if you look at Zen Buddhism, again, that's sort of the core attempt of Zen Buddhism, is to bring us to that point, to the point of systematically unprogramming ourselves, deprogramming from the false narratives and the false identifications that we've developed along the way for whatever reasons. So I propose a purposeful Zen meditation, or purposeful mindfulness meditation. That means mindfulness meditation that's goal-driven. And the goal being, let's desensitize to let's identify false narratives and false schemas of ourselves. And then let's do sustained presence, allow those false narratives and false schemas to begin to desensitize and dissipate, and hopefully just be removed altogether. And this is different than mindfulness meditation in psychology today, because we don't go that far. We sort of stop with symptom management. We say, you're experiencing anxiety, all right, let's give you some meditation, and we're going to reduce those symptoms. We're going to get you feeling peaceful. We're going to stop that incessant, worrisome thought. Or if you have depression, we'll say, let's identify those negative, self-defeating thoughts, those gloomy, catastrophic thoughts, and let's just align with a present state of mind and allow those to fall by the wayside. But we never say, why are those thoughts there? Where are they coming from? What sustains them? We know that there's a continuum happening here, and we know that negative thoughts or worrisome thoughts can sustain worrisome thoughts and negative thoughts. But where do they originate? And could they be tied to our sense of self on a deeper level? Is that the origin? And if that's the origin, well, then that would suggest that we need to work in that area, right? We need to work in the area of desensitizing or restructuring these false narratives of self. Otherwise, all we're ever doing is treating symptoms, meaning it's like having a viral infection that creates a rash, and all we keep doing is putting cream on the skin. We never find the viral in the body, the viral infection and the virus, and actually attack that. We just keep treating the symptoms. Well, the hope is if we treat the symptoms long enough, and this does work to a degree, that, well, we can't remove the virus, we can, at the very least, have nice skin, right? So hopefully in the future, psychology will explore self-cognitive schema under the scope of Zen Buddhism a little closer, and with a little more depth and goal-driven directives, I guess you could say, than symptoms management.